rates. Ultimately, this is where we want to hang our hat. We want to see young people graduate from high school because, again, think about the journey to adulthood. Think about what makes for a positive transition from adolescence to adulthood. The first step of that transition is finishing high school. You finish high school, then you may go to college, you may go into a trade, you may get a job. Each of those pathways lead to career, financial stability, starting a family, so on and so forth. But if that first step doesn't happen, of finishing your education, that's how you see young people go on to worse outcomes, including a greater likelihood of staying stuck in multi-generational poverty and being involved in the juvenile and criminal justice system. So we've seen the data, but let's really drill this down. Let's take trauma, which we all know the academic definitions, and really boil it down to what it looks like in the hallways and in the classrooms of our schools. We know that stress due to childhood trauma can lead to behavior that, yes, can be disruptive to the classroom and to the school environment. And unfortunately, disciplinary responses like suspensions and expulsions can often be the primary way that schools approach these issues. However, inevitably, they're punishing these young people for natural reactions to the toxic stressors that they have experienced in other parts of their lives. And simple, blunt disciplinary solutions don't address the underlying causes of the behavior. We look at the behavior, we don't look at the root causes, and that leaves the young people being repeatedly excluded. I still hear it all the time. Well, if you punish this kid and teach them a lesson, they're going to learn and they're going to come back and do better. Well, if all you do is punish, all you do is suspend, but you never address the underlying trauma, that's how you end up with young people in a cycle of being repeatedly suspended. And when, in so many of my clients, I saw that they've been repeatedly suspended, but no one ever looked to say, where is this coming from and what's happening? That's why punitive interventions are overall ineffective when the source of behavior is trauma, because you're not dealing with the core of what's happening. So I want to really focus in on 5 different facets that we commonly see trauma manifesting in young people: trouble forming relationships, self-regulation, executive functioning, hypervigilance, and negative thinking. These are 5 behaviors that oftentimes there's a reaction to a young person, but not necessarily tying how these behaviors connect to trauma. So trouble forming relationships. These are the kids that they're just into it with everyone. They have issues with teachers, they have issues with other students. It's easy to say, well, that kid's a bad kid. They're just out there causing trouble with anyone. The reality, though, is when a young person has been subjected to alleged abuse or neglect, the reality is that they've been ignored, hurt, and sometimes they even feel betrayed by the very people in their life that they should be able to depend on the most. And because of that, oftentimes these are young people who don't have a model of adults in their lives recognizing that they need support or how to ask for help. It's difficult to trust. This is something that I saw even as a defense attorney in court, as I'm going into court, you know, hearing after hearing, fighting for kids, and you still see that distance because they've been let down and disappointed. Trust doesn't come easy. And if all you do is discipline this kid, they think you're just another person who doesn't believe in them and lets them down. And it pulls attention away from a kid that actually needs more, who actually needs trusting adults who can do the work to earn that trust and let them know that, yes, there are good people who are here to help you. And it gets around some of that trouble forming relationships. Poor self-regulation. This is about our young people who have difficulty managing emotions. So you think about the data we just went through. Think about the young people who are behind, the young people who are struggling, who get frustrated with their schoolwork. It may manifest in frustration and acting out behavior and raising their voice in a quote unquote bad attitude. Inability to refocus. I'll talk a little bit about police in schools, but some people think, oh, well, an officer had to pat you down. That should be no big deal. Move on with your day. Well, for a kid who's had traumatic experiences with that before, it's difficult to wind down. That experience, the anxiety of it, it can stay with a kid all day. And that whole school day can be lost because no one's there to really break down why they feel the way that they feel. And so it's important to have supports in our school when a kid does react or a kid does, have those heightened emotions to help a kid de-escalate. Because if not, that kid can end up reliving trauma and it can distract away from schoolwork and lead to negative behavior. Executive functioning is another facet, the way that trauma manifests. And to me, this is a critical one because trauma can lead to attentional issues that can look a lot like ADHD. They can impact the kid's ability to follow the curriculum, perform academically. This can be the kid that forgets homework. This is a kid that's impulsive and just kind of sees other kids doing things and then just reacts and joins in without thinking it through. Again, this is why, and I'll talk about it in a moment, evaluation is important because the kid clearly has these issues that has another source, but determining if it is ADHD or simply trauma issues or issues they need to work through, the approach and the solution are very important. But again, when a kid acts out in these ways, it should be a signal. Maybe this is a trauma issue and not just a kid who's not focused or cares about their education issue. So hypervigilance, this is one of the ways that trauma manifests very often in school to prison pipeline, and that I certainly saw a lot in young people I represented. These are young people generally who have dealt with significant levels of emotional or physical abuse, who are in a constant state of fight or flight. These are kids who can seem irritable, who get the bad attitude label, and seemingly can go from 0 to 100, who can go from joking and being in a good mood, and then one joke taps into something, and then suddenly they're angry and they want to fight or they're aggressive. This can lead to major behavioral incidents. But again, if we understand that a kid has this level of trauma and we have a counselor or someone who's able to build that relationship, you have someone who can de-escalate this. But if this is unaddressed, this becomes the kid who people say, oh my God, the kid's always fighting. But again, it's not just because this kid comes into school saying, hey, I want to knuckle up and fight. It's because there are underlying issues that need to be addressed. And now kind of moving away from the emotional dysregulation of the kids who tend to act up and out to some of the kids you see showing up in your chronic absenteeism data, are the kid who sits in the back with a hoodie on, the kid that puts his head down on the desk, the kid that gets lectured, do you even want to learn or do you care about your future? Negative thinking, particularly when it comes to emotional abuse and that level of trauma. A young person who's still developing, hearing negative things being told to them about themselves, that they begin to believe them themselves. So it's not that this kid doesn't care. Sometimes the kid is afraid to try to raise their hand and answer that question. If you grow up in an environment and you get something wrong and someone yells at you or tells you you're stupid, that's going to inhibit. You've never had the positive reinforcement to want to raise your hand and participate. When someone comes down on them and says something negative, I mean, I know some adults think that that's motivating to a kid. I'm going to come down hard on you and that's going to motivate you to do better. But when a kid's already been beaten down emotionally, it is hostile attribution bias. You do believe that, well, that's just another person who doesn't like me. It has the opposite effect of driving a kid sometimes further towards depression than inspiring. Um, and so this is, again, just reframing the way we look at these common behaviors in the classroom. So now I want to talk about there is, it says overlap, it really is more of an intersection that can exist between trauma and special education. And I'll preface this by saying, not suggesting at all that special education services are the approach for any or all or even most young people who have been impacted by trauma. But under the emotional disturbance or emotional dysregulation category of special education, there are moments where trauma is so significant that it can lead to eligibility for an IEP. So under this category, one of the 13 categories of which a young person can qualify for an IEP, when a certain condition is exhibited over a long period, we're talking it's been like this for more than one school year, to a marked or significant degree, some of the disruptions we've talked about, and it's adversely affecting educational performance. So we know this young person's, capability from testing is here, but they're here largely due to these suspensions and exclusions and these types of behaviors. And one of these 5 factors are present. So you have these factors, and there's an inability to learn that's not explained by intellectual, sensory health factors, inability to build and maintain satisfactory interpersonal relationships with peers, inappropriate behavior or feelings under normal circumstances, pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression, or somatization or developing physical symptoms. You can connect those to trauma-impacted behavior. The inability to learn, explained by those factors, taps into executive functioning, inability to build and maintain satisfactory relationships, trouble forming relationships, inappropriate behavior, hypervigilance, self-regulation, a pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression, negative thinking. So when you have these things going on for a long time and to a significant degree, I know in cases I was involved with where I came and did advocacy on the school level, I said, let's evaluate. Maybe it's an IEP, or maybe it's just a recognition of issues that require more time with the counselor, an adjustment counselor, or some other intervention. But we need to get to the roots of the underlying issue and the underlying trauma. And in some cases where there's serious and significant trauma, it may need to go down the path towards an IEP. So again, educational success is a key measure of well-being. We cannot ever say the words best interest of a child without centering their need for educational attainment, because the importance of education to a young person and their eventual outcomes is so central. But when trauma-related behaviors show up, unfortunately, they're met with punishment rather than not that before you even get to treatment, not even evaluation that can lead to treatment. And we have to recognize that these school disruptions and being sent home is hard on the child and it's hard on the foster placement. And it has a negative impact there as well. So it's really critical that teachers, school personnel, that we don't simply say, John or Jane did this, how do we punish them? They begin asking, what is going on in John or Jane's life that is leading to these types of behaviors? Because when we don't, it leads into the school to prison pipeline. And so just for setting the table here, what are we talking about in the school to prison pipeline? There are tons of amazingly written research reports which give you academic definitions, but the way I have always described it is that the school to prison pipeline is really 2 simultaneous concurrent pipelines. One school discipline and one school-based arrest. And both of these take young people, drive them out of their school environment, and increase their likelihood of ending up in a juvenile or criminal justice system. The school discipline one, we're talking about frequent, repeated suspensions and expulsions. So the folks who say, well, we'll punish that kid and teach them a lesson and they'll learn, and then on the 5th, 6th, and 7th suspension, they're still trying the same approach. What this ends up doing, it disconnects a young person from the school community, and it's not helping, is actually increasing the chance that young people will end up in the criminal or juvenile criminal justice system. We know this from research from the University of Chicago, which found that young people are twice as likely to be arrested during periods where they're out of school during a suspension or expulsion. And that increased likelihood applies both to students with and without a prior history of delinquent behavior. So a lot of young people, that first time they end up being sent to the juvenile justice systems, it happens while they are out of school. School-based arrest is when things escalate even further, and it ends up in an arrest for behaviors that can be, quite frankly, resolved through alternative approaches. So when we see young people acting in a disruptive way, including many that are directly rooted in unaddressed trauma, the decision is made to arrest the kid and send them to court rather than trying to get to this behavior early and attempting restorative or therapeutic approaches, which can both calm this person down and move them away from these types of negative behaviors, but do so without the case moving forward into the system. So we know the school to prison pipeline is alive and well in Massachusetts, and it has a harsher impact on students of color. We've talked about racial disparities in the child welfare system. We have to acknowledge how it manifests here in the school to prison pipeline, where Black students are almost 3 times as likely and Latino students 2.5 times likely to be suspended. Black students are disciplined twice the state average, Latino students 1.5 times the state average, and students with disabilities, again, often our most vulnerable students who have IEPs and need specialized instruction and extra services, they are excluded and missing class time at nearly twice the rate of their non-disabled peers and twice the state average. And the part of this, those numbers were pre-K to 12. But when we look at our youngest learners, the kids who are getting the building blocks that they will need in math and reading throughout their educational journey, Black students are 4 times as likely, and Latino students are 3 times as likely in the early grades. How does that manifest? When we're talking about reading on grade level, which is absolutely critical for any student in their educational journey by the end of 3rd grade, students of color are less likely to reach that milestone due to missing time out of the classroom due to this exclusion. Well, Leon, I read the newspaper and these exclusions, I'm sure they're all serious. I read about these really serious things that are happening. Well, this is why we look at the data. And what we find out is that contrary to headlines and popular belief, many of these exclusions do not involve criminal or serious violations. In fact, in the last school year, 45%, nearly half of school exclusions were for nonviolent, non-criminal, and non-drug. I am not suggesting that young people are not struggling right now. I am not suggesting that fights are not happening and things that we don't want to see kids doing are not happening. We're still suspending too many kids for low-level behavior. And again, I go back to it again. This causes hours of lost instruction where students with disabilities miss more than twice the statewide average for days of lost instruction due to suspension, and Black students miss more than twice the statewide average for days of lost instruction. And so when we see, again, Black, brown students, students with disabilities missing more time in the classroom, inevitably that contributes a greater likelihood of grade retention and dropout. And so again, I talk about the exclusion with young children, and I always get, are we really suspending kids that young? Excluding the 1 year where students and were mostly in school remotely, last 4 years that we have data, you can see thousands of hours of lost instruction for small children where they're missing on these key building blocks due to suspension. And tying this back into trauma, we know trauma can affect young people from an early age. So sometimes our youngest children who have an even more difficult time processing their emotions are impacted by trauma. And rather than meeting these young children where they are and addressing the underlying trauma, these young children are being excluded from school. Shifting to the school-based arrest pipeline, we know that the mere presence of a police officer in school leads to 3.5 times as many arrests as schools that do not have police. And there's considerable evidence that Black and brown students and students with disability end up being more likely to be arrested when these types of behaviors, including behaviors driven by trauma, end up rising up and being unaddressed. How do we know this? We know this directly from the source because focus groups were conducted with SROs from different school districts, urban, suburban, and rural, and and overwhelmingly they admitted that the line between what's arrestable and what's disciplinary is blurred, and that behaviors considered criminal in one district and one school on one side of town are not in others. And inevitably more diverse schools, more schools that have more low-income students end up having, and even schools that have, that focus on special education students end up having a greater inclination to involve law enforcement in certain types of behaviors that, again, are arising out of an issue, trauma, that should be treated. And again, when we look statewide, we can see Black and brown students, 27% of our population, 64% of our school-based arrests. And when we talk about the presence of policing, which again, when things are not going great in our schools, the need for more and more policing often gets brought up, but we also have to own that there are damages to academic performance and school climate that are rooted in this being the approach we take to behaviors, including trauma-impacted behaviors. So there is research by tracking grants that are used for school policing, showing that discipline goes up and graduation rates and college enrollment rates go down when police presence is increased in schools. But it also has a detrimental impact over school climate. There are some young people who come into our schools, and part of the trauma they are dealing with arises from negative experiences with law enforcement, be they personal experiences or be they having seen family members go through those experiences. Those young people, their sense of safety isn't increased by the sight of a police officer. Furthermore, there are certain practices that happen. Again, you're a kid, you're impacted by trauma, and then suddenly you're being patted down, you believe unfairly. That's something that can spike your anxiety to the point that you may not be able to refocus the rest of the day. And that's like a day of learning that's been compromised. So we see here in this slide, the information comes from focus groups directly with young people, and that school climate can be negatively impacted by the presence of law enforcement, especially for students who are already grappling with mental and behavioral health issues and trauma issues. And it's important here to sort of bring this all together in saying that anyone can be impacted by trauma, but there are differing levels of impact when it comes to when we look at race and trauma. So just under half of the kids in the United States have experienced at least one ACE, or adverse childhood experiences. But we see how this breaks out differently by race and ethnicity. So nationally, 61% of Black children, 51% of Latino children have at least one ACE, higher than that average, while we see white children and Asian children below the average. Moving nationally, just move into New England. You see 44% of Black children and 28% of Hispanic children have had at least one ACE, compared to 22% of white and 11% of Asian children. So when we look at adverse childhood experiences, we have to acknowledge there's an intersection of race and an increased likelihood, oftentimes, at the race in general, but even race and poverty, of young people having had these experiences. And again, students who are impacted by trauma are also likely to be harshly disciplined and excluded from school based upon acting out of that trauma, and that has the disproportionate impact on young people of color. And I want to just quickly, before, as we're winding down, drill down on race and poverty and race and disability. So we can see statewide, within each racial group, you see students with disabilities more likely to be excluded. But you can see race and disability higher rates of exclusion for Black, Latine, and multiracial and Native students who are students with disabilities and white students with disabilities. When we overlay poverty, again, you see a white kid living in poverty is more than 3 times as likely to be excluded than a white kid not in poverty. But still, we still see the disparities, most significantly for Black kids and multiracial kids, but also for Latine kids at the intersection of race and poverty. And so just to really summarize this section, students who exhibit challenging behavior often can be those with trauma histories, because being exposed to chronic stress or trauma, it can delay brain development, it can cause lags in skill development, it can lead to challenging behaviors, but simply punishing these behaviors doesn't fix the problem. You can't punish your way out of a social, emotional, behavioral issue. It has to be something that's treated. And the last part is I spent nearly 2 decades working in juvenile court. I've worked with this population. I know it is not easy, but these young people don't lack the will and desire to behave well, often due to trauma and the disruptions in their life. They often lack the skill and support. And it's important, even when challenging, to focus on finding support. And in some cases, there may be a level of discipline that is needed, but there needs to be an understanding that we have to treat the root cause if we truly want genuine change, because punishment enough doesn't do it for this particular population. And so with that,